Hello everyone, Santor here, and welcome to another Thinking About Game Design video following playing Elden Ring. I finally been able to play through the game, and today I want to talk about the reinforcement systems. I want to be very clear what I'm talking about here. This is the process by which you strengthen certain gear. So there are 6 things in Elden Ring that you reinforce. I showed with 5 fingers because that's how many I have to hand. And those are Estus Flask Count, or not Estus Flask, Crimson Flask. They're the Sacred Flasks, that's what they call them. My brain is like, this is what it is, a decade of Dark Souls. But the Sacred Flask charges potency. Those are two separate things. Smithing Stone weapons, Somber Stone weapons, Grave Glovewort, and Ghost Glovewort. Those are a tongue twister. So those are the 6 different types of reinforcements that you can do. And I want to talk about these systems because I have some thoughts about them. I am not a big fan of these systems the way they're currently implemented, and I want to talk about why. But I think it's useful to get a little bit of context. So I want to start talking, because it's been something that's been evolving. Technically from Demon Souls, I haven't played Demon Souls. I've only watched gameplay. I'm a Nintendo plus PC gamer, so I haven't played that. So I haven't played that. I haven't played Bloodborne. Those also have reinforcement systems in them. But I'll be talking about a little bit about Dark Souls 1, Dark Souls 2, Dark Souls 3, and then Elden Ring. Just kind of talking about how this reinforcement system has kind of evolved over time, and why I have the feelings about it that I do. So first up, it's really important to establish part of the reason why I don't tend to like these systems, as they currently are in Elden Ring, is because I'm the sort of player who likes to upgrade as many different weapons and armor, armors thankfully is no longer an issue. That's a huge improvement that's happened over time. But I like to upgrade as many different weapons as I can. I like to have as many tools at my disposal. I'm somebody who likes to have a lot of variety. That's something that I enjoy about games. That's something that I like to do. I like to do different combinations and try different things out and play around with systems. So I'm not talking about, by the way, infusions. The Ashes of War are an amazing system. It's fantastic. I think that there's room to expand with some additional options in there, like an Ash of War that lets you cast spells. That would be cool. But I really like that system, and the flexibility and the ease of changing things, once I understood how it worked, is a fantastic addition to the series. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about reinforcement. So reinforcement has a few benefits, and I do want to highlight these just in general, mostly to play pacing, as well as providing a reward structure for players and an alternative path to getting more powerful that's not reliant entirely upon levels. Think about how miserable a soul level 1 playthrough would be if you couldn't reinforce any of your weapons. So reinforcement is an alternative way of strengthening things, and reinforcement materials is a nice reward, and being able to spend souls/runes on reinforcement is something that also allows you to do something with those that doesn't require investing the full cost that a level may take, especially at higher levels, as the cost of getting a new level goes up. So I think that's useful, right? Those are very useful things that the reinforcement system does. And I think that is something that's valuable about them. So there's also some value to limiting how many additional weapons you can make, because the first couple of additional weapons adds a lot of options to your arsenal and dramatically increases your relative power, just because you have more choices about how to approach things, but it does hit a point of diminishing returns. And it's kind of when it hits that point where I kind of want the ability to upgrade stuff to open up and become freer. Anyway, I said I want to talk about a little bit of a history. I found the reinforcement system most interesting in Dark Souls 1. For those who are unfamiliar with it, this is a somewhat complex system to try to explain. You have there's a modification step that happens. So first of all, you can reinforce some armors. I'm not going to talk too much about armor reinforcement. It was a thing in Dark Souls 1, you could reinforce some armors. This would increase their defensive effectiveness, their damage absorption, typically. Dark Souls 2, you could really reinforce a lot of armors. I don't think many players liked reinforcing armors. You had to spend a lot of materials to upgrade an entire set. and then you kind of felt kind of stuck to that set. It was bad for fashion souls. Everybody loves their fashion souls. And people tended to gravitate, at least in my experience, towards things like the I forget the exact name of it now. The Nazgul set, the Daughter of Chaos, black robe set in Dark Souls 1. People tended to gravitate towards that. It didn't require upgrades, so it tended to be a bit stronger than other things, particularly for its weight and things like that. Thankfully, in Dark Souls 3, they abandoned the idea of reinforcing armor, and they have continued to not require that, or to not have that as an option in Elden Ring. I think that's a good choice. Nobody wants to spend their precious upgrade materials, and this is part of the problem, right? Their precious upgrade materials on armor. So in Dark Souls 1, for reinforcing weapons, you would get them to +5, and then you would have a modification step. And modification allowed you to be able to branch off into a couple of different routes. So you could use green Titanite shards. So you upgrade with Titanite shards. So there's Titanite shards, large Titanite shards, Titanite chunks, and then Titanite slab. And there were green Titanite shards, which were kind of an equivalent to large shards. And then there were red, white, and blue chunks that could further upgrade weapons that you'd gone the green route with. So green Titanite shards were used to make a weapon fire, divine, or magic. And there's different places where you did this. So you could take a weapon to +5 and then modify it into being a fire weapon, a magic weapon, a divine weapon, or you could modify it to +6. There's also technically raw, but raw was terrible, so we won't discuss it. And then once you got a weapon up another set of 5, you could modify again. So a +10 weapon could be modified to like a boss weapon, a lightning weapon, a crystal, which was also very niche, or just +11, and then you could take it up to the maximum. There's also, so fire weapons could be split into fire and chaos. You can see this is very complicated. Fire and chaos. So basically what's happening here is the infusion system is baked into the reinforcement system. And so your weapons could branch off at a couple points there and then take them to +5s. There's also Twinkling Titanite weapons, special reinforcement. Boss weapons use Demon Titanite to reinforce. Twinkling Titanite weapons just went to +5 and completely bypassed the entire rest of the system. To get boss weapons, you had to get a weapon to +10 and then modify it into a boss weapon, and then you could get it to +5 with Demon Titanite. So this system incorporated in aspects of what we've come to know as the infusion system. I'll talk about that in a moment when we get to Dark Souls 2. There's also another set of reinforcements. There is Estus Flask Potency reinforcement, which used Firekeeper souls. You can get 7 Firekeeper souls in a playthrough, but you can only use 6 because you needed a Firekeeper to reinforce an Estus Flask. And if you get the soul from a Firekeeper, you can't have that Firekeeper reinforce the Estus Flask because she's dead. So you can only get it to +6 on New Game. You could get it to +7 on New Game Plus. I really like how that works out. It's just, there's a nice, like, there's 4 Firekeeper souls you can find, 3 Firekeepers in the world. Get them together. That's all the Firekeeper souls. That's how much you can get your Estus Flask. That satisfies the certain design aesthetic within me. I have a bit of Melvin tendencies, for those who are familiar with that terminology. But this is really important. Firekeeper souls could be used for something. If you got your flask to +7, you couldn't upgrade it any further, but you could use a Firekeeper soul as a consumable item for a full heal and 5 liquid humanity. Liquid humanity was used for various things, such as kindling bonfires. Kindling bonfires is how you'd get more Estus flasks. So you'd rest at a bonfire, you'd get 5 by default, be brought up to 5. If you had kindled it once, you'd get 10, and with the Rite of Kindling, you could kindle it 2 more times to get 20 from that specific bonfire. And so this system didn't feel like there's wasted upgrade materials in that regard. And also, there's very limited numbers of slabs to max out a piece of gear. There's also dragon scales, which is similar to the crystal, or to the Twinkling Titanite upgrade path, where it's like, okay, there's like five or 6 dragon weapons in the game. You could pick one of them, and in a single playthrough, get it up to +5. Some other really important things about Titanite usage at this time. The rate of Titanite usage was a bit different. So it was like 1, 1, 2, 2, 3. so a total of 9 pieces of Titanite to go from to get from +1 to +5. And there was some stuff there where it was like 10 to, because you needed 1 to modify and then another 5 to get it up, and some stuff like that where some of the usage was like 9 or 10 depending upon which path you were going. Twinkling Titanite followed a similar pattern, except it ended with 4. So 1, 1, 2, 2, 4 for a total of 10. And same sort of thing with Demon Titanite. I'm going into a lot of detail here because this system is complex, but also because there's certain things that I'm going to want to reference back to. So that Titanite usage rate created a certain sort of scale where you'd need slightly increasingly more as you went, but it's kind of stretched out. So you needed like a total of 9 pieces for that reinforcement like tier before you modify. So this brings us to Dark Souls 2. Now Dark Souls 2 split things off in a couple of different ways. First of all, with Estus, it introduced the concept of an Estus flask shard, and I forget exactly what they called it, but it's bone dust that you'd burn in the bonfire in Majula, and that would strengthen your Estus flask. There was no other use for it, and once you got to maximum, any more copies of that item were useless. Same thing with Estus flask shards, and that's where this began. I don't like either of these systems because getting extra copies of an item you can't use doesn't feel great, but as long as you can use like new game, just a standard playthrough, gets you the quantity of the item that's like you can't, once you've gotten all of those and gotten up to max, you can't get any more added to those items, but you're not going to find any more either. You can see where this is leading with golden seeds, by the way, but we'll get there. So that sort of change and transition suddenly introduced an item that on New Game Plus cycles as a pickup is useless. There is nothing to do with Estus Flask shards or the Bone Dust in New Game Plus. And Dark Souls 2 is the game that most encourages you to go into New Game Plus, by the way. It adds like new stuff in New Game Plus and New Game Plus 2. It has the bonfire aesthetic system. Like that is the game that is most focused on New Game Plus cycles and encouraging you to go into them. So, like, tons of additional stuff. There's a lot of great stuff that Dark Souls 2 does, but anyway, they also introduced the infusion system. So they simplified regular reinforcement paths. They added fire seeds for upgrading the pyromancy flame. I think that's in response to Dark Souls 1 didn't have an upgrade material for the pyromancy flame. It just had put souls into it, which is how I want reinforcement to kind of go. We'll get into that in a moment. But it's just chuck souls into it to reinforce it. So Dark Souls 2 it was like, maybe we want to make it take a little bit more to limit how quickly, like if you just farm up a bunch of souls, you can really just dump them into the pyro flame and get a lot of power very quickly, because that's how the reinforcement system works. You put into it, you get out of it. Now, part of it also is that pyromancy didn't scale with anything. That also meant that it wasn't tied to your stats. So that's another thing that made it go crazy in Dark Souls 1. But in terms of like relative power. But with Dark Souls 2, they kept the Twinkling Titanite system. They made so boss weapons were no longer modified into. It was just trade for them from Ornifac's, everybody's boss weapons, just up the road character, or Strayed, if I remember his name correctly. And then you would use Dragon Bone. For some reason, they decided to change it from Demon Titanite to Petrified Dragon Bones, whatever, to reinforce them up to +5. So Twinkling Titanite is pretty much the same. Boss weapons have been brought in line with Twinkling Titanite, but use a different material. So your other weapons just use 6 Titanite per tier, 6 shards, 1, 2, 3. To get to +1, +2, +3. Large shards to get 4, 5, and 6. Chunks to get 7, 8, 9. And then a slab to get to 10. Pretty straightforward. And then this is where we got Infusion. I think Infusion was handled better in Dark Souls 3 and then better again in Elden Ring. But they added Infusion stones that you could unlock from another blacksmith and then use a separate thing. Separating out reinforcement from Infusion means that the interesting part is infusion, is now separated out from the reinforcement system. So that just leaves reinforcement as a raw get stronger system. I personally don't find raw get stronger systems all that interesting. I like it when they add gameplay options. But just raw get stronger means that you're creating a barrier to something being an interesting gameplay option. So here's the deal. The reinforcement system, by its design and the way that it's structured, means that your ability to play with other things is limited. Yes, you're investing in a weapon, you're making it stronger, but by doing so, unless you're able to bring other weapons up to that tier, you find a new piece of loot and it doesn't mean anything unless you can reinforce it. There's no, like, if you have a +7 weapon, doesn't matter which game, if you have a +7 weapon and you just pick up a weapon, the weapon you picked up is going to be inherently weaker compared to the +7 weapon. That's just how the system works. Now, the thing that's nice about reinforcement is, unlike a traditional RPG, every weapon kind of starts off as a baseline of weak, and through reinforcement gets strong, rather than finding, your copper sword to your bronze sword to your iron sword to your steel sword, where it's just inherently this weapon is stronger than this weapon, and there's nothing you can do about it. At least with the reinforcement system, they've kind of kept that RPG thing where you find stronger and stronger gear as you go, and enabled any weapon to become that stronger and stronger gear that you find as you go. That's a pro to that system. But a con is you find a new piece of gear and you're getting it at its base level of weak relative to what you currently have. And if you don't have, you can't just try it out and see if it's any good. You have to level it up to that point. And reinforcement materials tend to be used as good rewards, which means that you're often not rolling in them. Or if you do have a lot of them, you have the ones that are halfway up to where you are, right? You're rich in shards and you need large shards. You're rich in shards and large shards, but you need chunks. You're always kind of lagging behind on any secondary weapons. You can never get it up to the point where it's a comparable comparison to see if it's any good with your current weapon. So that brings us to Dark Souls 3. Dark Souls 3 continues the Estus Flask reinforcement scheme. Again, I have some issues with that. Going into New Game Plus and getting the materials to upgrade that and not being able to do anything with them is a feel bad to me. It improves the infusion system by spreading out the things necessary to kind of do it in a more interesting way, and by adding some additional stones and taking away some confusing ones. Overall, I think it did an improvement to it, but it kept the same sort of structure otherwise. It just changed Petrified Dragonbone to be Dragon Scales, but still, shards, large shards, chunks, slabs. But it does something terrible. It requires a slab to get to max on every type of weapon. In Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 2, you could max out Twinkling Titanite weapons and boss weapons without Titanite slabs. This allowed you to be able to get those special weapons up without having to spend slabs on them. And it also made slabs an extremely limited resource. Dark Souls 1 slabs were a very limited number that you could just pick up wildly, but it was possible for some enemies to drop the different types of slabs. Now, there were several different types of slabs. There was, in Dark Souls 1, there's your regular Titanite slabs, and then there's the 3 different colored ones, red, blue, and white. These different colors of slabs meant that you were kind of encouraged to kind of get tools in the different types. You could make a divine weapon without compromising the resources that you needed to make a regular weapon. You could make a fire weapon without compromising the resources you needed to make a regular weapon. And there's a little bit of overlap in green Titanite shard use for those side weapons, but it was also super easy to farm a lot of green Titanite shards and from the leeches in Blighttown. It's like they dropped them in bundles of 5, so it's very, very easy to get the numbers that you needed if you wanted to. And this is the big thing. It's this acquisition of upgrade materials that is constantly the problem. If I want to be upgrading my 7th weapon, Like, I understand making the second one a bit challenging. Like if you look at a standard character, you're probably going to want like a weapon, a shield, and maybe like a secondary weapon or two, maybe a ranged options for around like 3 to 5 weapons per character, right? One of those can be like a boss weapon. One of those can be like a special weapon. So those are using 2 different upgrade tracks in like Dark Souls 3. But you're still kind of capped on like, once you get beyond that point, you're starting to hit the point of diminishing returns, right? And I want to be able to hit that point of diminishing returns where I'm no longer gaining a whole lot by upgrading additional stuff. I'm just getting more toys to play with. And it feels like the reinforcement system is impeding that with the way it's been implemented. So hopefully that whole history hasn't bored people too much. I will try to put some chapter markings in there. But that brings us to Elden Ring. Elden Ring introduces a better infusion system with Ashes of War and all that. But let's look at reinforcement. It decides to simplify the names of reinforcement, but it does something really significant here. With weapon reinforcement, and this applies to Spirit Ash as well, it uses a very tiered system. So for regular smithing stones, there are 8 tiers of smithing stones, and you need 12. This is the same numbers in Dark Souls 3. For some reason, in Dark Souls 2, it took 6, 1, 2, and 3 to get up 3 levels to get to the next tier of material. Dark Souls 3 doubled it, as I recall, to require 2, 4, and 6 rather than 1, 2, and 3, requiring 12. This requires you to get more upgrade materials. I don't know why they did that in Dark Souls 3. It lets them give the player more rewards, but it also impedes their ability to get upgrades to things. And they continued that in Elden Ring, except instead of being shards, large shards, and chunks, it's smithing stone 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And then your, I forget, I think it's just Ancient Dragon smithing stone for 25. Because it's still 3 levels. It's still 3 levels per regular smithing stone material. And then it's just, you need so many of them. And then there's the Somber Stone. Somber Stone replaces Twinkling Titanite and Demon Titanite / Petrified Dragonbone / Dragon Scales. It has its own final upgrade material of a Somber Ancient Dragon Smithing Stone, but there's a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9 of those. So it's a very tiered system, and that same system applies to Grave Glovewort for upgrading regular spirits and Ghost Glovewort for upgrading special named spirits. So it's kind of got its regular material and then Somber sort of system kind of applied there as well. This tiered system, especially for the Somber and the spirits, has... so there's some pros to this very tiered system. I think it's bad, personally, and I'll get into why in a moment, but there is a significant pro in that it encourages you to upgrade a wider variety of things because the material is worthless for anything else. That's a pro. A big con, and this is something that I ran into in my playthrough, is that you can get locked at tiers, especially with how late you get access to the bell bearings to be able to buy infinite of these upgrade materials for a number of them. It felt like Grave Glovewort was really late, and that's just the order in which I came to things. Some of this is going to be the order at which you come to things. It's a fairly open game. There's some amount of that, but then there's other stuff that's locked behind progressing to a certain point. But I had this problem where I was rolling in Glovewort 2 through like 5 or 6 or whatever. I had a ton of it, but I could not get anything past Grave Glovewort 1 because I could not find enough Grave Glovewort 1. And this is largely because I did not know how to explore the game fairly thoroughly in Limgrave, and I didn't find enough of those earlier catacombs that would give me the lower tier material. But I was stuck, unable to get past that lower tier for a very long time, with a bunch of the upper tiers in my pockets. I had, 10 plus of starting with Grave Glovewort 2. But I could not find Grave Glovewort 1s to get there. And this is a huge problem with the tiering thing. If you do not make players able to buy it, and it's an open world where they can miss it, then you can create bottlenecks with it. And that happened to me a bunch. Particularly stands out in my mind of being bottlenecked on Grave Glovewort. There's also the, even if you can buy it, the cost factor is very, very high. It's not too bad with Grave Glovewort. I did the math. 32,200 runes for the Glovewort itself. That's not the upgrade cost. That's the Glovewort cost. That's the materials cost. Ghost Glovewort is 48,300. That's not too bad, but those spirits usually cost like 10 grand by the time you're getting to like 9 and 10. And there's very limited supplies of maximum upgrade materials, by the way. I think we'll get into some more of like my analysis thoughts, but I just want to make sure we're understanding the system here. Somber stones. So if you want to get a weapon to +9, and it's a Somber upgrade, and you're buying all of the stones, that's 97,000 runes. 97,000. And that's the better of the two weapon paths. If you want to get a regular smithing stone weapon to +24, and you're buying all of the materials, that is 129,600 runes. Because you need a dozen of each tier. It is more expensive for a regular smithing stone weapon. Now, they're more flexible, because you can change the Ashes of War, and you can change the infusion on them. So they are more flexible. But that is a lot of runes that you're asking me to shell out to be able to get this weapon fully upgraded. So there's also, I mentioned it earlier, I want to touch on Sacred Flasks before I get into this more too. Again, like Golden Seeds, the fact that you can get more than you can possibly use because you cap out in a new game cycle, that's fine in that I want them to have enough that you don't have to find every single one to be able to get the upgrade. It's a big game, and the Golden Seeds are not as immediately obvious. A number of them are locked behind bosses. Wish I could do something with them. What I think would be really cool is if there's an NPC that would show up once you fully upgraded your Sacred Flasks, if they would take Golden Seeds and even Sacred Tears depending upon how they handle Sacred Tears. But if they take Golden Seeds and give you something for them, like a Rune Arc or something, it'd be really cool to be able to, or even just buy them. It'd be really cool to be able to do something with Golden Seeds after I'd maxed my flasks, especially since it's very possible to have extras. That's just something that frustrates me. I like in Dark Souls 1 that the things that get you more Estus Flasks and stronger Estus Flasks, like, one of those is a completely separate system, and one of the, like, from reinforcement, it's reinforcing your bonfires, and those hit a cap, but the material that you're using to reinforce them has other uses, like just having it on your person improves some of your resistances and increases your item drop rates and stuff like that. Like scale the chaos weapon type of things like that. And the other you can use for like a full heal is basically like a super humanity. Fully heal you and give you 5 liquid humanity. So it's like those have uses outside of this reinforcement system. The other is just contained within it, and I want some uses. I want something to do with all of these golden seeds. They're just sitting there, useless after I've maxed out my flask. So anyway, back to weapon reinforcement. The reinforcement system, I liked it. I think I've kind of covered how it works well enough. The problems with the bottlenecking, there's just a lot of tiers to get through. It does help stuff with pacing and trying to, like, they're very good for giving as rewards to players, but it also very much so limits, like, finding a new weapon becomes less and less exciting the further you go on, and the harder and harder it is to have the materials necessary to get it up to the point of being actually useful. And that's something that, especially for the sort of player that I am, is very frustrating. So I also, however, see the value in this system. I see the value in having the sort of progressive rewards. I see a value in having a reward path that's alternative to just getting levels. And I think there is value to that. I think there's use to that. And so the challenge then becomes, what are the ways to do this where it wouldn't have some of the downsides? Like, if Somber Stones only were just Somber Stones, like Twinkling Titanite, and you could get a weapon to plus 10 off of them and just required more and more Somber Stones as you went, how does that change how people approach things? And if the same thing was true with Grave and Ghost Glovewort, like, I probably would prefer that system, but it still kind of doesn't address the fundamental thing. So let's try to come up with some potential solutions. If we want to preserve limiting player options, but also adding flexibility, there's something that I heard that a game whose name I don't recall, that I haven't played, but does something similar, implemented, where you can basically transfer upgrade levels from one weapon to another. So if you get a new weapon, you can take all of the upgrade levels from your current weapon and put it on that weapon and try it out. Something else that I've thought of is taking it, again, though, that means you can't use as many upgrade materials as rewards. Upgrading your blacksmiths so you can buy more levels to your weapons. That's another way of kind of like tiering the rate at which you can get upgrades. That also would kind of do it, potentially, but again, it means you cannot give upgrade materials as a reward the same way. They're much more special, much more valuable. That creates another problem. Making the final friggin' upgrade tier infinitely purchasable in some way would be an improvement. Dark Souls 2 was the least bad of these. It has always been bad. Anybody who thinks Dark Wraiths drop Titanite slabs at anything approaching a reasonable frequency is wrong, in my opinion. They don't drop them very much at all. I've spent way too much of my life farming Dark Wraiths. Yeah, they don't. They drop chunks at a pretty good rate, but they don't drop Titanite slabs at a good rate. You know who drops Titanite slabs at a good rate? The friggin' undead, or the friggin' stone soldiers in Drangleic Castle in Dark Souls 2. That's where I farm slabs, and you can get a bunch of slabs that way. But Dark Souls 2 finally allowed you to be able to purchase chunks. You could purchase large shards, Twinkling Titanite, regular shards, green shards in Dark Souls 1, but you couldn't buy chunks of any variety. You couldn't buy slabs. Dark Souls 2 at least allowed you to buy chunks as well as the other two, but you can't buy Twinkling Titanite or Petrified Dragonbone. You got to go farm that somehow. So guess what? There's two chests with 3 in the Sunken King DLC, and I farmed the snot out of that, where you can grab a bonfire ascetic on the way, reinforce that bonfire, grab a chest. I think it's like one chest, maybe 2 chests, that has 3 each of Twinkling Titanite and Petrified Dragonbone. I got a save where it caps out at 99. I don't know how high that bonfire actually is in that one, but it's high. Finally, in Dark Souls 3, you got the ability to buy shards, large shards, chunks, the Titanite scales, because they kept changing the name, and Twinkling Titanite. But then they really cap you on chunks, or on slabs. They're just super capped on slabs. And every single time, it's like they make a slight change to this system, and it's like, okay, you've made it better in some way and worse in another. And it's not interesting to me. After Dark Souls 1, reinforcing my weapon's not interesting to me. It's just busy work. There's some good gameplay that you get out of like the first time experience, but like at a certain point, I've beaten the final boss. I'm not going on to the New Game Plus cycle yet. Let me just buy the final upgrade materials, please. Maybe apply a massive discount to upgrade materials. Something. There's a point in time where you could be like, okay. Like another idea that I had, upgrading weapon categories. So like, let's say you like longswords. Okay, you can apply upgrades to the longsword category. That's another way that you could do it, where you provide enough materials that you can fully max out all categories in like 3 new game cycles or something. I don't know. Again, I don't think that's a great solution, but it's a solution. I like the idea of making it so that way there's more of a way to have other new weapons that you find upgraded to the same sort of level as your current weapon after a certain point. Like it's tricky because you want to have, and this is why design problems are hard, right? Because there's always trade-offs. The benefits of the system is that it limits player options to where they're having to make interesting choices about what weapons they're going to have access to. And if you want to go beyond that, you're going to have to find ways of getting these materials. And they always, the ability to purchase them has often, not always, but often lagged behind the ability to actually, like, what stuff you're finding out in the world. So the loot that you're finding out in the world is useful because the stuff that you can just buy from the store is lagging behind it. But it makes these upgrade materials good rewards for the player. It can be so hard to find good rewards. So it's like that's a great reward system. I really don't like the tieredness in so like where it's Somber Stone, Grave Glovewort, Ghost Glovewort 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., where like you have to keep being able to find stuff of tiers because it's getting uneven quantities and tiers creates a lot of gaps and holes in how you can upgrade things, and it can be really frustrating. That in particular is so not something that I like, and then you need so many smithing stones, and trying to find them and stuff is just it creates a certain sort of play experience that I think works well within a narrow band, but the more things you're trying to upgrade, the worse and worse it gets. And so this is why the system rubs wrong for me, because I like to try to upgrade a lot of different stuff, and I understand that increases power at a certain point. So like there's reasons why you want to kind of constrict that at certain levels, but I want some sort of solution that allows me to be able to say, wait, no, I want a different set of tools and repivot, and something similar to what they did with Ashes of War and the Whetstone Infusion stuff, where you can just go to a site of grace, and change what stuff you have on it. Maybe if they implemented some sort of way of being able to, you know what could work actually, is if they had some sort of I'm not sure. I wanted to come up with a name for this. I don't need a name. I can just describe the mechanic. It's a mechanic where you have some sort of base, like, core essence of a weapon that's able to be transmuted within a certain category of weapons. And so that's what you're upgrading, and then you can apply the weapon to it. So, like, maybe sorry, having to recalibrate my brain, free-flowing ideas. So maybe something where you have a hilt that could be made into a great sword or a straight sword, or a dagger. I'm spitballing ideas here, so you need to refine these. Remember, in design theory crafting, it is an idea, and until you've implemented and tried it out, you don't know if it works. But if you had like a hilt where that is what you're upgrading, and then you could you could feed it the essence of weapons that you find, and then you can transmute it into those, and maybe it can hold a limited number, something like that, where this weapon you can turn it into this particular straight sword or this particular great sword. And then that's what you're upgrading. And then you can find a couple of these different like hilts or handles or whatever, where it's like a polearm staff, and you can turn it into a scythe or a spear or a halberd. Something like that would allow you to be able to have like categories of weapons that are kind of bundled together that this thing can become, and then you can upgrade it. And then you can find more of these hilts or like buy more of them, but then you have to upgrade those individually. Maybe something like that would allow you to be able to like feed tools to these, but it can only be any given one at a time. Something like that, where you can have your variety of options, but you have to pick which selection words at this particular moment that you want. Something like that feels like it could work a bit better to me. Again, I'm just trying to brainstorm ideas of ways of trying to address something that really frustrates me, because I really like these games overall, and there's a lot of good that I have to say about them, but there's a couple of pain points, and the reinforcement system is become quite a pain point for me. And I mean, again, they could alleviate it. Like, something else that I was thinking is another potential solution is that each upgrade material that you buy from the store decreases the cost of buying upgrades materials from the store. So, if you've purchased, say, 72, just throwing a number out there, 72 is like 6 times 12. So if you've bought 72 of each individual upgrade material, it's free. Something like that, where you can just be like, okay, we acknowledge you want to upgrade everything. You've upgraded so many secondary things, you've hit diminishing returns. You don't need to farm anymore. You don't need to waste your time farming. Just buy all of the upgrade stones you want for free. Something like that. Or like, there's a system that I have in mind of like, you buy one and the next one's 1% cheaper, right? So each time you buy one, it gets cheaper and cheaper and cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. But having that cumulatively roll into trying to buy like 30 at once, it becomes a lot more complicated of a thing to implement, because you're having to take into account, okay, the first one is 100% the cost and the next one is 99% the cost, etc., all the way down. And also kind of like messes like with merchants are just kind of selling them out in the world. That kind of gets a little bit weird. But some sort of system that means that once you hit a certain point in the game, if you want to upgrade everything, you don't have to farm for it, and you can just upgrade everything. That's what I want, effectively. I don't know. Again, I presented a couple of different ideas of ways to try to address this problem. Hopefully I've articulated the problem. I don't know if people liked the whole section on going over the history of the reinforcement systems from Dark Souls 1 to 2 to 3 to Elden Ring. I think it's interesting. I think it's interesting to see how the design has evolved over time. I do think, by the way, that combining Twinkling Titanite and Titanite Scales, or the boss weapon upgrade material, was a good idea. Having those as separate materials made a lot of sense in Dark Souls 1. Combining them, like, it made less sense when you hit Dark Souls 2, because boss weapons were an upgrade path in Dark Souls 1. They were a modification. They're part of the reinforcement system, not a side of it, like Twinkling Titanite was. So I think combining those made a lot of sense. It's just one of those things that's really interesting to me in design is when you create a system, and to some extent this goes back to Demon's Souls, but I feel like Dark Souls 1 is a bit of a refinement on that. But where you create a system to solve a problem, and then you've solved the problem with it, and then you take essences of that system and you modify and iterate over it over time, you get legacy features of that system that kind of remain there, that made sense with the way that you originally implemented it. But because you're using that as the solution to the problem that you were trying to solve then, but you've modified enough about how that's working that it's you have lingering elements of a system in such a way that you no longer need them, if that makes sense, or rather it locks you into a pattern of thinking. And if you stepped back and said, okay, knowing what we know now, what is the problem we're trying to solve and how can we solve it? Instead of just dragging the solution along, because reinforcement and the modification system and everything in Dark Souls 1 was solving a problem of how do we make weapons more powerful, how do we change their behavior and their functionality and stuff, and make it clearer than the way Demon's Souls worked, because Demon's Souls was, from what I understand of that game, like I've watched playthroughs of it, but not having firsthand experience means I don't retain a lot of the details in quite the same way. the way that reinforcement system worked was very convoluted, and the points at which you could branch out was not clear. And I think Dark Souls 1 is a much better implementation of the idea that they were doing in Demon Souls than what Demon Souls was doing. Dark Souls 2 was doing a different system, but it was iterating off of the Dark Souls 1 system and is trying to solve problems from the Dark Souls 1 system, where the reinforcement was complicated. Like, one of the advantages of infusion that was introduced in Dark Souls 2 is that if you had a weapon that you liked but you didn't like the infusion, you just had to like use a few stones to change what was on it. That is a way less expensive than undoing the whole modification, having to do another one, which you could do in Dark Souls 1. You could say unmodify this weapon, bring it back down to the maximum of the previous tier, and then I can do a different modification on it. But you'd lose all of the resources you put in to bring it up to that tier. It was much less expensive to change a reinforcement with infusion, and then they made it like functionally free with Elden Ring. And maybe another potential thing is maybe we don't need reinforcement in the way we've done it to solve this problem. Like, there's other rewards that you could give the player to potentially try to address this. Or you could create a different system that's trying to solve that same sort of problem of, okay, we want weapons to grow increasingly powerful over time, independent of player stats, right? Because you can have weapons where it's just like there's no reinforcement levels, it's all a matter of scaling. But then that puts all of the players' increased power into stats, which is maybe something that you want, but when stats are growing increasingly expensive, having systems that don't increase in cost the same large amount that stats do is beneficial. So like that, there's use to being able to increase the strength of your weapons outside of increasing your stats, outside of the scaling system. It's good for people who want to do low-level runs. It's good for people who are just going through the game more quickly and are not leveling as much. It's good for like some other pace of play things. So, if you grind a bunch of levels and get a lot of stats, having lower scaling and having the need to get upgrade stones also means that you can't just overpower things through levels either. Like, you need to level up both to get strength. Or like you'll get more strength by leveling both, but like having to invest in your weapons does a lot to make sure that you can't become super powerful just off of stats, which there's benefit to that, right? So it's like there are benefits to the way this system works, but you could always come up with something else. And if it was just stats, like that's a different system. Maybe you could do something where instead of like you reinforced upgrade paths, right? So maybe instead of upgrading your weapon, you upgrade heavy. So you can make any weapon strength at like +8. But if you want to make a weapon keen or quality, suddenly that's not something you can really do. Because maybe you have that at +3. Like, that's another way to try to solve the thing, right? Or maybe you just find stronger things. So maybe you find heavy, and then maybe you find a heavy +1 blade that lets you make heavy weapons stronger. Like, that's a different reward structure, right? It's trying to solve that problem with a different reward structure, where it bakes it into the infusion system, and getting infusions that are stronger, as it were. So like that's another way that could be done. And the benefit of that would mean that you could make more of those wet blades. Like if it was like wet blade, like sacred wet blade, that lets you make weapons sacred, and lightning wet blade that let you make weapons lightning damage, right? Just using what Elden Ring does. And then you could find sacred +1, which would allow you to make a sacred +1 weapon. Having that would mean that you'd find a lot more wet blades out in the world, but it would also mean that you could have access to different element scaling types earlier, which would be really nice. Especially if you're like me and you're trying to make a strength faith character and you overlook locations where wet blades are, and you don't find ashes of war that are for holy or like faith scaling, because you just happen to miss where Sacred Blade is hanging out near the Third Church of America. open world games have their own problems, especially if you have significant things like that are kind of like just it's players can overlook stuff and find that their plans for what they wanted to do with their build don't feel like they're working. That's a whole other discussion. I'm planning on making an Elden Ring review video. This has probably gone on long enough. I just hit the 50-minute mark in the recording, and I'm not editing stuff out because this is not happening if I do. So hopefully I've given you something interesting to think about, and I look forward to talking more about this game, Elden Ring, in the future. I think the whole series has a lot of really interesting stuff, and there's way more to it than just a reinforcement system that I have grown frustrated with. So thank you all very much for watching, and until next time, everyone, take care and goodbye.